I don't really know how to start shows.
Come on now, don't start liking me now.
So yeah, I'm funny compared to, well, you'll see later. I stand for mayhem!
I know a lot of fucking idiots who think a lot of shit is mean-spirited just because it goes against what they believe.
But the relief of comedy is to take things that aren't funny and it allows us to laugh about them for an hour.
We got a purple suit to buy and a gigantic coffin.
Why are you laughing?
Evening, everybody. Welcome to Why Are You Laughing, a history of comedy podcast. And today, I am pleased to introduce to you the legendary Mel Brooks, one of the greatest, comedy filmmakers but honestly, one of the most acclaimed filmmakers of all time, really. A genuine legend who I'm not, it's interesting because I think Mel Brooks' career is kind of a lesson on taking the right path in comedy or entertainment in general. So we will get into that today. Definitely a more well-known figure than Mort Saul, who we covered a couple weeks ago, and equally, or if not more important. So we'll get to Mel in 1 minute. But first, I want to tell you about blindmike.net, because if you're not on there yet, if you're not on Patreon or all the free links, whether it be Apple, Spotify, YouTube, then you're not a real, you listen to Why Are You Laughing? You're not a real fan.
Yeah, you're also a sucker.
You're a coward is what you are. So go to blindmike.net. If you want to just support the show for free, leave a 5-star review, subscribe to the YouTube. I don't know how much that matters now that it's been demonetized for some reason, but subscribe in case we ever figure it out. And if you'd like to throw a few bucks behind us, then go to the Patreon, because that's where you get bonus episodes. Whether it be Joe Matarese Part 2, The Pelican Brief, Opie versus Jim, the Pablo Francisco drinking game, Norm on The View, and we've got a couple coming in March as well. I think the next one I'm looking to do might be, do you remember a guy named Tucker Max?
No.
He was honestly kind of the first Portnoy. Like, I think if he didn't get exposed, he might have had the career that Dave Portnoy ended up having. And then it turns out he was a big liar. So we'll tell his story on the Patreon coming up soon. So look for that if you want to subscribe. And so Mel Brooks, would you consider yourself a Mel Brooks fan, Craig?
I like things that he's done, but I couldn't say I'm
it's funny.
scholar.
I think that's kind of the response everyone. There are people that say I'm a diehard Mel Brooks fan, but I feel like the most common answer is like, yeah, I like his best stuff, but it's for whatever reason, I feel like he doesn't have as many, diehard fans as a lot of other big figures in comedy. But if you look at what he's done just as a filmmaker, he's up there with some of the greats ever. Like, not a lot of guys win Academy Awards for comedy.
No.
And he's a true EGOT winner. Like, a lot of times when you see people have won Emmy, Grammy, Oscar, and Tony, I consider it kind of a, what's the word I'm looking for? Cheating, I guess. Like when you see a composer on, it's like, that doesn't really count. You weren't going for all 4. You just lucked into it. But Mel Brooks genuinely won all 4 of those for things he created. So we will dive in. But he had the pretty much a stereotypical comedy childhood. His father passed away when he was very young. He was born on the coffee table of tenement housing. And I think based on the context that he tells the story, I knew that tenement housing was obviously very poor housing, but I just wanted to make sure, look into exactly what it was. And it's a single family house that multiple families live in. And they would quarter off these rooms. Essentially, a lot of the rooms were windowless and very tight. So it's Section 8 to the 10 millionth degree, essentially, is what tenement housing sounds like. So that's how he grew up, without a father, single mother. They were not very well off. He said his brothers, I think he was the youngest of 4 or 5. I forget if he said he had 4 brothers or the youngest of 4. but they essentially were like the father figures in his life. And if you've ever seen Mel Brooks, he was a scrawny little guy. So, you know, growing up in the streets of New York, that could sometimes be tough. And he kind of gives a reason that you'll hear a lot of comedians give for how they got funny. Like if you grew up in a certain era, you kind of had to either be tough or funny. And so that's what Mel Brooks talks about here, as well as the kind of influence his father, or rather his father's passing had on him. He did an interview with Playboy back in the day that got very deep into his life. And that's what this excerpt is from. I figured you'd rather hear a narrator's summary would be better than my just rambling of it. So let's hear a little bit of that.
During the interview, he talked about the intimacy of male relationships in his movie Blazing Saddles. As he explained, I can't tell you what sadness, what pain it is to me never to have known my own father. If only I could look at him, touch his face, see if he had eyebrows. Maybe in having the male characters in my movies find each other, I'm expressing the longing I feel to find my father and be close to him. In that 1975 Playboy interview, Brooks also revealed that he and most of the other Jewish kids in his neighborhood didn't swim because they would get picked on by other kids. If they did go to the pool, they had to travel in packs to protect themselves. Even in his predominantly Jewish neighborhood, he was, in his own words, scrawny. But he found another way to make himself valuable. As he put it, why should they let this puny kid hang out with them? I gave them a reason. I became their jester. Also, they were afraid of my tongue. I had it sharpened and I'd stick it in their eye.
And that, you know, I feel like you hear that from a lot of comedians, is they kind of built a sense of humor as like a shield, essentially. Like they weren't physical guys. They weren't, you know, physically imposing. So they were like, I got to figure out a way to not get picked on. Maybe I'll just use my words, which is how a lot of comedians are birthed. And the other thing with, you know, growing up without a father, that's another very common trait of a comedian. And it's an interesting insight into parenting, because it almost makes you think like, maybe I shouldn't be too good to my kids. You know, I could create a great filmmaker if I just abandon this kid now, you know?
Yeah, if you just trip him once in a while, you may be on the gravy train later in life.
Give him some adversity, for God's sake.
Yeah.
And that is what, you know, adversity is exactly what a lot of these older guys, I know I talk about it every time we bring up someone kind of from the World War II generation, but the type of lives they led and genuinely lived back then is so different than what anyone in entertainment now deals with growing up. So Mel Brooks, another guy that served in World War II, and he was really, unlike a lot of our characters, you know, we've talked about Chevy Chase and Lenny Bruce and people like that who have done everything they could to avoid serving in the military. Mel Brooks was like a genuine patriot, and he saw, you know, kind of a cause that he wanted to fight for, and that's what led him to the Army. So he talks a little bit about that here.
You fought in World War II. You served.
I was.
Did you see any action?
A little. I was short. I lived.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they shoot over you.
They shoot over you. Yeah.
Listen, the Army sent me to the Army Specialized Training Program. Sent me to VMI. When I was 18, I was in the regular Army, and at VMI I had studied electrical engineering, cosines, tangents, slide rules. I knew. And the Army said, well, since he studied engineering, we'll put him in the combat engineers. So they did. And what do? You take a bayonet and you look for mines, planted mines. And they could blow up a tank. I mean, they're big, they're telemines. And
your job was to try and find with bayonets?
Just you find them and unearth them and take them, you know, really that was part of the combat engineer's job. And if it could blow up a tank, I mean, it could certainly take away a Jew in no time.
I thought that was a good line. But, you know, it's interesting because when he talks about his service, genuinely, like, he saw what the cause was. And growing up a Jewish kid, you know, he saw Hitler was none too keen on the Jews. And Mel Brooks said, this guy's got to be stopped. But it was also interesting. He did Marin's podcast years ago. We'll play a little bit of that later. But one thing he did mention that I found interesting was when he served, and they ended up talking about this, where I guess this was common. I guess when he served, he was not aware of the concentration camps, or at least like the extent to which they went and things like that. Like a lot of that wasn't found out until years later. Everyone knew Hitler, couldn't be bothered with the Jewish people, but he didn't realize to what extent it went, which I find very interesting and makes sense because news doesn't travel in the same way it does now, Plus, you can't really get the surveillance you can now, so it's not like you're going to see like the... Yeah, exactly. So it does make sense, but I never really thought of that, I just assumed they knew everything that was going on.
Right.
But yeah, he's like very proud of his service and talks about how he still has his, his military fatigues and all of that. So like, a genuine American, and that really influenced his career because there's a real theme of Hitler stuff, as well as just history in general. Like Blazing Saddles is a Western, the history of the world, obviously. Obviously it's all parody and satire, but it is influenced by some interest in the country and history and things like that. So. But so his career is, again, when we talk about these old guys, they all start similarly because they had to figure out, they just wanted to be entertainers and they didn't really know how to accomplish that. So they had to be, song and dance men or, spin plates and juggle or whatever the fuck they had to do to get onto a stage. So Mel Brooks, if you know his career, he is interested in music. And that started with him being a drummer. So, he would play drums in different bands and things like that. And one night he had to replace a comic. The comic got sick and they were like, can anyone fill in for him? And he's like, well, I remember his jokes. And so he just went on stage and repeated this guy's act. And then that, he would do, later he would do impressions. He did an impression of Sinatra and things like that. But here's where first of all, his birth name is Melvin Kaminsky. And the reason he went with Mel Brooks is, his mother's maiden name is, I believe it's, Brookman. But he went with Brooks because that's what fit on the drum set. But Kaminsky was too long to fit on the drums, so he just had to put something. And he was like, Mel Brooks, I guess. And that just stuck. So
solid name.
Yeah, much better than Melvin Kaminsky, actually. I wonder if we would ever have known the name Melvin Kaminsky.
I'm not going to see that movie.
Yeah, right. So I find that interesting, the fact that he kind of started technically in stand-up. Because the little I've watched, I guess I've watched more than the average person now, just prepping for this episode. But, you could argue I don't know the full scope of Mel Brooks's what he could have done as a stand-up. But from what I've seen, Mel Brooks strikes me as someone who's conversationally a little schmaltzy. He started in the Catskills, and that's very evident. By the way, side note, one thing he mentioned that I found interesting that it never dawned on me before, similar to the World War II thing I mentioned. He talked about performing in the Catskills, and he's like, obviously, you only perform there in the spring and summer. There are no performances in the winter, and that never dawned on me because I know all these guys go through the Catskills, and I was like, oh, that's right, it's in the Northeast, so it's like a seasonal business. So comedy at one point essentially was seasonal, at least in certain parts of the country.
That'd be tough. Yeah, I can't laugh right now. It's too cold.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's no. I can't go see a show because of the weather. What was I saying? Oh, so Mel Brooks as a stand-up is kind of an interesting lesson to me because, to me, he comes off. Hack is the wrong word, but it's the feeling I have. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like a little schmaltzy, almost like an old man you'd talk to. You're like, that's kind of funny. But if you're around him too long, you're like, yeah, we got it.
It's tough to be a hack when you're the first.
Well, but it's not what I'm just saying. Conversationally, I wouldn't be like, this is the funniest guy ever.
Oh yeah, no, definitely.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Yet as a filmmaker, you could absolutely make that argument. So I guess all I'm trying to say is it's interesting. Like if he was dedicated to stand-up, if he said, I have to be a stand-up comedian, we may not even know who Mel Brooks is. And now, because he chose the right path, in my opinion, he's one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. And his movies still hold up today. Like they're discussed today, years and years later. So, he always knew, he says that he wanted to be in entertainment. And that I do believe. Like a lot of times when people say shit like that, I think it's kind of revisionist history. But like when you do hear him in interviews, like I said, he's not necessarily my favorite interview to listen to, but you can tell he's an entertainer. Like he's very on, he's always performing.
Right.
He's an interesting guy. So like he does seem like a guy who genuinely was like, no, I'm not working in the garment district or whatever. I want to be on stage, Yeah,
this doesn't get me going.
Yeah.
Sick dress.
So basically, Mel is a guy that what I have learned in prepping for this episode is essentially Mel Brooks' career is a lesson in persistence, because basically he would hang around guys like Sid Caesar, who was one of his biggest influences and biggest, had probably the biggest impact on Mel Brooks' career. He would kind of just always be around. Like these guys would be at certain clubs and things, and Mel didn't necessarily have a reason to be there, but he would make sure he was there to kind of build a relationship with these guys. And eventually, one day, Sid Caesar was like, all right, do you want to jump? He's like, yeah, sure.
Why not?
So we'll get more into that in a minute, but what clip-wise, where are we at?
Hitler.
Yeah, so like I said, Hitler largely influenced his career, and he talks about that a little bit.
One day, the commissary was crowded. We only had 20 minutes to eat. I took my general step. We're dressed up. I swear, I'm not making this up. Let me see. I want to get my comb so I can prove it. Yes. This proves it. I went out like this, as Hitler. I went out as Hitler with my mustache and my hat, my uniform. All of us, the Nazi general staff, we went to the Apple Pandali on Pico Boulevard to have an Apple Pandali. Well, you never saw a service like that in your life. They were. Normally, can I get you anything else, Mr. Hitler? Or water, Mr. Hitler? I mean, we were in and out of there in about 10 seconds. I mean, but we really.
You get canceled for saying that now.
Can I get you anything else, Mr. Hitler? Mel Brooks is also a guy. I always thought this about Letterman too. He seems better as an old man. Like he fits better as an old man for some reason.
Yeah, he was built to be an old man.
Yeah, like he was supposed to be. Looking at him young is weird. Maybe that's just because I know him as an old man. But he just feels right as an old guy.
Oh, for sure. And he's 96 right now. Just old as hell.
Yeah. But yeah, he talked about Hitler, and it wasn't even necessarily a thing like growing up as a Jewish kid during World War II. He said he was more fascinated, and like he talked about there, like the power and how one man could influence that great a scope of the world, like how one guy being charismatic and influential, like genuinely changed the course of time. And that really fascinated him. So he would kind of use that in different ways in his works throughout his career. All right, let's move on from Hitler into some lighter stuff here.
You got Carl Reiner and the 2,000-year-old man.
Yeah, so Carl Reiner is. Here's one thing I liked learning about Mel Brooks is that he seems like, and this is probably true of old Hollywood in general, much more so than now. But Mel Brooks built like genuine, very long-lasting friendships, and Carl Reiner is probably the most prominent of those. But Sid Caesar, he was friends with until he died. His wife, his second wife, but is Anne Bancroft. He was with for 40 years, I think, until she died. So he genuinely built these like long-standing relationships in Hollywood. And, you know, now because there's so much money involved and things like that, I don't feel like you see that. But the nice thing about old Hollywood and why people like going back to watch, you know, old Carsons and the Dean Martin roasts and shit like that is because you got the vibe that it was a tight-knit community.
Right. They were friends.
And now that doesn't exist just because of the internet, essentially. Like now there are very famous people that have never even had to go into Hollywood, you know, have just made a TikTok and gained, you know, 10 million followers.
Right. You go back then, like you take the biggest actors and you know they're hanging out a few times a year at least, you know?
Because they kind of have to. Yeah.
Right. And, and now you could take the two most famous, I don't even know who the hell that would be right now, but they probably never even seen each other.
Yeah. I mean, The Rock and Leo have certainly never been in a movie together. I don't know if they hang out a lot, but.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, so I lost track of where we are. Get me back on track here.
Carl Reiner and...
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So one of his most famous bits, or one of the things he's most known for, and that's even hard to say because he has so many monstrous hits, but something he's very well known for and still will do, like I found a clip of him doing this at like on the Emmys or Oscars in 2014. So they kept this up for a very long time, but this is Carl Reiner talking about them coming up with the 2,000-year-old man bit.
When he was about 21 years old, I was about 25, he was a friend of Sid Caesar's, not working on the show, and he came to visit once, and the first day I was there, this man stands up and he starts to say he was a pirate, a Jewish pirate. And I'll never forget the first lines. He says, you know, he says, I can't set sail anymore. I can't afford to set sail. He says, you know what they're charging for sailcloth? $4 a yard. I can't afford to pillage and rape anymore. The first words I heard from him. And then,
those first words out of Mel Brooks' mouth.
Yes. And the following day I came in, there was a program called We the People Speak. And I said, that's a good program to satirize. And I said to Mel, here's a man who was actually at the scene of the crucifixion 2,000 years ago. Is that true, sir? And he went, oh boy. I says, you knew Jesus? He says, thin lad, right? He walked around with 12 other guys, sandals they wore. He says, they came into the store all the time, asked for water. I gave it to them. They were nice guys, never bought anything. That was the first line.
That was the beginning of it.
And then for the next 10 years at parties, when it was dull anywhere, we'd get up and do it. And it took 10 years to get it on record.
And then it blew up.
Yes.
That's such a great detail. Yeah, they never bought anything.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of that bit is it's very like it's a you know an older Jewish guy, but the bit is that he's 2,000 years old, so he's talking about Jesus and the crucifixion. So it is genuinely a very funny bit. But one thing I do find, another thing I kind of love about that era, and I'm very interested in, is that they would always talk about a lot of these bits that we've talked about. I forget the other examples, but there have been others that we've discussed where it comes from like a nugget of an idea that these guys would do at parties. So like we said, there'd be these Hollywood parties and, you know, Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks are there and someone says, hey, do that, you know, 2,000-year-old man bit. And they'll just break into it and everyone will kind of gather around and watch it. And all I can think of when he's telling that story, just because I guess we grew up in a very different era, is how hard I would be rolling my eyes. Look at these two douchebags.
I know.
Meanwhile, they're two of the greatest comic minds who ever lived.
The worst part would be being dragged into it. You're like, oh, all these people are looking at me. Come on.
Yeah, the worst would be being Mel Brooks at the fifth party you have to do it at. Yeah. You're like, I just want to have a drink and enjoy myself. Come on.
Cocktail weenies, dude. I've missed them at the last 4 places.
I'm always working at these things. Yeah. But, you know, the reason I brought up that bit is because it turned into an incredibly successful album. And Carl Reiner said that basically all they had to do, like someone mentioned to them, hey, you know, this could actually make a good comedy album because comedy albums kind of started around that time. And they said, all right. And they went into a recording studio. It took them 2 hours. They cut it down to 47 minutes. And we're just like, here you go. And sold tons of copies. So pretty easy work for something that's still remembered, 60, 70 years later.
That's wild.
But yeah, like I said, and you heard Carl Reiner say there, I don't know if you caught it, where he said he would hang around with Sid Caesar, not working there. So these guys ended up working on Your Show of Shows, which it was Sid Caesar's show. And he hired Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner and Neil Simon. Another thing I do like, I kind of shit on the schmaltziness of Mel Brooks in some of these interviews, but there are other times where he's very honest and very funny. And another, I guess Neil Simon's brother, Danny Simon, also wrote on that show, Your Show of Shows. And Marin told him this story where he goes, hey, I went to a writing class that was taught by Danny Simon. And Mel's like, oh, no kidding. And he goes, yeah, he was a very bitter guy. And he kept telling us basically how he taught his brother everything he knows. And Mel just goes, yeah, he was always like that. It's not true. We didn't teach him anything. So, I love when those guys get to a certain age. They're like, I don't give a fuck.
What do I got to lose?
But Your Show of Shows, it was a variety show. There's nothing you can really compare variety shows to now, because now like SNL would be considered a variety show. But back then they were this big production. But by all accounts, Your Show of Shows was very innovative and kind of cutting edge for that time, for the 50s. And like I said, they had these great writers. I think Woody Allen wrote on it towards the tail end. And there are a lot of parallels between Woody Allen and Mel Brooks. And I thought Mel Brooks had a great description of it, where he said, essentially what he said boils down to like Mel was very macro and Woody was very micro in the topics they chose. Like essentially Mel was like, I covered big world. I covered space and Westerns and, Hollywood and all these big topics. Whereas Woody would kind of examine like the inner workings of one individual man. And so they were these for like young Jewish kids, like those two guys became like the go-to names or faces for what was considered Jewish comedy. And they're very different guys. There are similarities that you can kind of see. Like I think the best example might be that you can tell like Larry David was definitely influenced by both guys in different ways.
For sure.
But there are major differences too. And I think, like I said, Larry David, probably a fan of both, but I think generally speaking, you kind of gravitated towards one or the other, Woody Allen or Mel Brooks, because they are so different in my opinion. All right. What's next?
More on Carl and Mel.
Oh, let's hear it.
If you have one good friend, you're lucky. And I have one good friend. I call him my best friend. My life is fuller because I've had Mel in my life. If he doesn't come over, I don't know what to do with myself. He comes over every night. We love movies. And we said any movie that has 3 or 4 lines in it, and we hear those, we know we're in for a good time. The lines are, lock all the doors, secure the perimeter, and let nobody in and out, and get some rest. He became an entity, and that entity wrote some of the best and most memorable movies of all times. I mean, to this day, farting is okay because he wrote a movie called Blazing Saddles.
Yeah, that is a thing, like, that you can kind of credit Mel Brooks for, is a lot of the silliness that is very, very common now and through the last probably 40 years or so. But before that, you wouldn't get stuff like that. Like there wouldn't be, sort of crass humor. And Mel's not the only one that paved the way for that, obviously. But he was one that did pave the way for parody and just mocking things that we otherwise would have taken seriously. And I mean, the big example would be Hitler, which I think we'll talk a little bit about when we talk about the producers. But the main reason I liked that clip is that I think their friendship is really like nice to hear about.
Yeah.
Because like it seems very genuine. And like I said, it was kind of nice to see Mel Brooks seems like a genuine guy who built these relationships that lasted, you know, in some cases 70 years. Like Carl Reiner just died a couple of years ago, and they would go to each other's house. Like in interviews, Mel would very casually say like, yeah, I was at Carl's house last Wednesday, of course, because like he would go over, you know, 3 times a week. Carl Reiner was basically like, you know, if he wasn't working on something, I essentially couldn't get rid of the guy. We were always hanging out. Whereas now, like, there's these people that are kind of marketed together, and we think like we're sold that they are best pals, when in reality it's like a working relationship. So it's just like it's nice when you see them come through as reality once in a while, you know. Especially
when they get canceled, you're like, I'm not friends with that guy. That's just on.
It would have been interesting if Mel Brooks ever got canceled or Carl Reiner. See if they stuck with each other. Yeah. I never really knew the guy, you know. We worked together.
Yeah, Carl Reiner deletes his Instagram.
Yeah, Carl Reiner's like, no, I wasn't just the straight man and the 2,000-year-old man. I genuinely didn't understand it. That's why I kept asking all those questions.
It's like, this isn't very fair. Yeah. But the next clips is the producers.
All right, let's hear a little bit about it, because I also didn't know. Essentially, my introduction to the producers was the season of Curb Your Enthusiasm where Larry David is playing Max Bialystock.
Yes.
So before that, I wasn't too familiar. I didn't realize how impactful the producers was. But let's hear about it.
I was doing a show, and the producer of the show, Broadway show, said, "Look, they want to release. So what are we doing next? What are we doing next? Well, give me a title." I said, "We're doing a musical called Springtime for Hitler. Tell him that." He said, I can't tell him that. I said, you tell him that. We're doing Springtime for Hitler. So Ed Padula was the producer. He was a little worried. He said, okay. He said, we're doing Springtime for Hitler next. And they said, who's in it? They said, we're not sure. You know, we just...
right past them, eh?
We just gave them the title, you know.
Yeah.
And then about a year later, I said, what a wonderful title. Springtime for Hitler. Now, if I can get some idea underneath that, you know, a story or something, I would be very happy. So I said, well, let me see, Springtime for Hitler, if it is a show, it's probably the worst show ever and in the worst possible taste. And I worked back from that. Yeah. And I thought of a Broadway producer, and then I thought of the Gene Wilder character, Leo Bloom, and from there on it was fun and easy.
Yeah. So I really never thought of the producers as a film that was kind of striking back against Hitler, but he got a lot of pushback for that. And, you know, people, and there's still plenty of stuff like this today, but people were like, hey, you can't satirize Hitler. And Mel Brooks would say, and, you know, a lot of the innovative guys of this time were pretty unanimous on this. And Mel Brooks was one of the kind of one of the leaders of the charge that said, like, hey, if you debate Hitler, then you're just as bad as him, because you're kind of giving his points credence. You're saying, hey, you know, we're having a back and forth here. We're debating whether or not you're correct by slaughtering an entire race of people. He said, what you do is you make fun of him. You just make him seem silly, and then people are less likely to buy into his horse shit. And that's something I feel like we've kind of forgotten now.
Well, it was as late as the 90s, as we found out.
Yeah, I mean, well, like I always say, these guys blazed a trail that we have been continuously dragging brush back over for the last 20 years or so. You know, it's weird because when, you know, Mel Brooks is an older man now, when he does pass away, there will be all sorts of tributes that say how he was a trailblazer, he was an innovative guy, he paved the way for so many people. And then the next time there's a parody of something out there that we deem offensive, we will jump on that person and, you know, try to ruin them and have it taken down.
Crucify them immediately.
Yeah, so he's a trailblazer to an extent. It didn't sink in with any of us, really, but...
Next, we got Dustin Hoffman.
Oh yeah, this is a little more from the producers. I didn't. I had never heard this. You hear a lot about guys like big names that turned down movies that became big, but this is interesting because it's more about a guy who was a no name playing a minor part that became Dustin Hoffman.
You wanted Dustin Hoffman in the producers.
Dustin Hoffman was going to play Franz Liebken, the crazy German with the helmet playwright. And he lived on my block in the village. And I'd seen him in a couple of things, and I knew he was incredibly talented, and I wanted him to play the Nazi. And I read the script over the telephone to him, and he said, I'll do it. And I said, okay, it's a done deal. You are Franz Liebken in the producers. Okay. 3 months later, I hear pebbles against my window at like 1 a.m. Pebbles. And I said, what is this, Cyrano? Who am I, Roxanne? What's going on? And I open the window, it's Dustin. And he's a little drunk, and he's in the street. I said, Dustin, you live a couple of houses up the block. And he said, I have great news. Maybe not for you. So I said, what is it? He said, they want me to audition opposite Anne, your wife, as Benjamin in The Graduate. Well, I knew the script, I said, go to Hollywood. You're a mutt. I'm not worried. The minute they see you on film, they'll say, oh, this is ridiculous,
It's just very. I thought it was just very funny to be like, I'm actually gonna play your wife's love interest and become one of the biggest stars of my generation. Thanks for the offer, but
I like how they're like. He's like, yeah, they're not gonna see much.
Yeah, big deal. So what's interesting too, he mentioned his wife, Anne Bancroft. He was married. He did get married very young and divorced fairly early. And he kind of just, I don't really know the full story, but basically one day he kind of just like left and he was sued for an illegal separation by his first wife. And essentially when he talked about it years later, he was basically just like, I got married too young. I didn't know what I was doing. So I don't know the full story there, but a lot of these guys that we talk about wind up getting married, 3, 4, 5 times. And I always whenever I see that, I'm like, what did they think would be different the fifth time,
You would think the second and especially the third time, you're like, I know what red flags are.
Yeah, let me hesitate here. What if we just were committed to each other, but not legally,
Yeah.
But Mel had a genuine love story. Like he met Anne Bancroft and they became a genuine power couple because I said Mel's an EGOT winner. She also won an Emmy, Oscar, and a Tony. Well, she didn't sing, so she never won a Grammy. But as far as acting goes, she won the big 3. So that is as far as talent goes, you would think that was just a marriage, almost a fake Hollywood marriage. But then when you see them in any interviews, you're like, oh, these two genuinely loved each other. So I think we have Ann talking about that in a bit, but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself.
I was going to say, you want me to go to
it? What's next? Let's stay in order here.
This is him on Maron talking about Jewish timing.
Yeah, so this goes to what I was talking about a little. By the way, like I said, he won an Oscar. He beat Stanley Kubrick, I think, was also nominated that year. He won an Oscar for The Producers. And you never see that with comedy. Now, to be fair, I don't know in the 60s if the Oscars were as snobby an event. I watched the clip of him accepting the award and Sinatra and Rickles introduce him. And it seems very loose. It seems much looser than the Oscars became. So I don't know if it's something that the prestige and snobbiness that is applied to the Oscars now was applied in the 60s.
It wasn't.
But you'll never see a comedy win
No.
these days, really.
No, it wasn't all about stuff that has nothing to do with why you're there.
Yeah.
So that's probably why.
But I apologize. Oh, you said the Jewish tie. Yeah. So this is what I was talking about, where there is a brand of comedy that guys like Mel Brooks kind of created.
There's a timing to it, you have this amazing timing. I was watching the stuff, the old Cavett stuff, and there's something innate about that timing. And I believe that with the shows and everything else, that the Jewish timing dictated most of modern comedy.
Yeah, it has to do with fear.
Yeah.
There's a great energy that fear can create.
Yeah.
Is that guy coming for me? Is that a fucking swastika? There's a fear. It's always lurking.
Yeah.
So and it creates a pizzazz, an energy.
It's a
fight or flight is right there for every Jew.
Yeah. And there's also that sort of being funny is sort of an acceptable way of being hostile,
right?
Which I think is helpful,
right?
But
that's very true of Maron's comedy, but yeah, I think there's a lot to that. That in some ways we've kind of forgotten, in many ways we haven't. But what I find most interesting about that is guys like Mel Brooks, Woody Allen, Mort Saul, who we talked about. These guys kind of had to figure that out on their own and pave the way. Now, if you examine a comedian, it's like, oh yeah, psychologically they're doing that, but they might not even realize it, because guys like Mel Brooks kind of created a formula for them, like a template that they could kind of work on. And that's what I find most interesting about these guys that were very early on in the modern comedy landscape. Like I said with his stuff about Hitler, is that's where a lot of comedy comes from. And I think when you're examining jokes, that is something people should take more into consideration. Is Ari Shaffir actually says this a lot, and I think it's a great point, that it's people will say to a comedian, don't you know that that's a sensitive topic? And it's oh, well, I'm making a joke about it, so I am actually fully aware of how sensitive it is. I'm bringing it up because I know how hurtful it would be to bring it up, I'm using it because I am aware of how awful it is. That's the only reason I'm even mentioning it. There's a reason Mel Brooks wasn't fixated on a mean, diner owner who ran a tight ship and was mean to his employees. He focused on Hitler because he was aware how sensitive a topic it was,
Right.
I think the other Maron clip we have is him talking about Sid Caesar, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So this is another one of his very influential relationships that he had.
I was backstage at Tacopa.
Yeah.
And Sid said, we get along. We hang out. We're funny. He said, this guy, Max Liebman, is coming to me. There's a show called the Admiral Broadway Review.
Yeah.
It's going to be on a thing called television. I said, wrestling.
Yeah.
He said, no, it's actually...
Is that all that was on television initially?
No, there was Milton Berle.
Milton Berle and wrestling?
And wrestling. That was all that was on. And Sid said, I'll give you $40 a week.
Yeah.
I said, great.
Yeah.
He says, just write whatever comes into your head, write jokes. Give me the monologues. I have to do them, And I did. We hung out together. It was a pleasure,
But was that a decision for you? Did you realize at some point, this stand-up shit's not for me? I'm not, I don't want to be stuck in this lounge act life.
No, I put it on the side. I knew I was going to come back to it.
Yeah.
But I said, Melvin, yes. I always talk to myself. I said, this guy's better. This guy's really good. This guy may be a genius.
Yeah.
And, and so it was a pleasure to write for him.
And there's an interview the three of them, Carl Reiner, Mel Brooks, and Sid Caesar, did with Larry King, and you can tell they're genuine friends. And then one of I think it was a Conan appearance or something I watched with Mel Brooks, where he was talking about Sid Caesar, and this was at the end of Sid's life, and he was 91 years old, and he suffered from, I don't know if he had like dementia or Alzheimer's or something like that, but he was not mentally all there. But Mel was talking about going. He's like, yeah, I go to visit him every Friday afternoon, and like I said, he's not quite all there. But like he said, if I bring up certain things about the old days, you see him kind of snap into like the old Sid Caesar. And so stuff like that was just nice. That's my main takeaway from examining Mel Brooks was he seems like a genuinely nice man, which I really liked about him.
I do like, it's such a flex to be like, I was backstage at the Copa.
Oh, well, that's what I meant to say. Actually, it's not, I don't think. I mean, in a way it is, but I took it more as a lesson on persistence because like Mel had no reason to be at a lot of these things. He was just, he was persistent and like, I'm going to be around this and kind of will myself into existence in their inner circle.
It worked
and
out.
So that's kind of what that resulted in is Sid Caesar, like seeing him eventually realizing he's funny and being like, hey, do you want to, will you write for me?
Got it. Because I'm always like Rickles used to perform there all the time and like all this stuff and people always talk about it. And then it was like the Studio 54, but way back.
Yeah. Well, Mel just weaseled his way in and then eventually belonged there. But
I'm going to get this jacket on my own.
Yeah.
Next we got Get Smart.
Yeah. So basically like Mel's early career was not necessarily considered successful. Like I said, he won the Oscar for The Producers, but financially, I guess, by whatever it was expected to do, it was kind of disappointing. And then he did a movie called 12 Chairs that he shot in Yugoslavia. And that was a box office bust as well. And Mel says 12 Chairs, he thinks, I forget exactly how he phrased it, not the best movie, but like the most fun or the most he enjoyed making him. It was something to that effect. Like that was one of his favorite movies, even though financially it didn't necessarily do that well. But he did have his, kind of foothold in TV with Get Smart, which became an institution.
Yeah, The Rock ended up, right? Oh, no, Steve Carell.
That was Steve Carell. I don't know if there was another one made.
Yeah, I think The Rock was at the end of that movie.
Oh.
Well, let's skip forward to Get Smart. Now, how much pressure was there in the wake of all the James Bond films to come up with a parody about spies?
There was also The Man from U.N.C.L.E.
Mel does a terrific job answering. What a horrible question.
He's like,
why would there be pressure? Someone better make a parody of a spy movie. I've had it up to here with the lack of spy parodies.
Yeah, they retired parodies when like The Godfather came out. I was like, I can't do it.
But nonetheless, I found Mel's answer interesting, so let's hear it.
And that was a great one to satirize. They took themselves very, very, very seriously. And then there was Cosby and, had done an I Spy thing. And so these spy things between I Spy and A Man from U.N.C.L.E. and James, we were flooded. We were flooded with spy junk. And I met with Buck Henry, a great writer who was the screenplay writer for The Graduate, which starred my wife, Anne Bancroft, as Mrs. Robinson. Mrs. Robinson, remember that? And so Buck Henry and I decided to write a show called Get Smart, starring Maxwell Smart, starring Don Adams, and the rest is history. I mean, we did it for fun. We never thought it would catch on. We invented this crazy cone of silence, the shoe phone, all of this insanity, and now it's on everywhere,
So he was, majorly successful in TV and film, which you didn't necessarily see as much back then. Like when a guy wins an Oscar, he's not really involved in TV back in the day. Now that could easily be the case.
Right.
Like Tarantino said he's working on like an 8-part miniseries or something like that. So now it's very different. But back then, TV was sort of the minor leagues. But, he dabbled in both and did very well. And I also thought it was just interesting to kind of hear his mindset on things because he says there was all this spy junk floating around in the world. And that's kind of always how he approached what topic he would take on. Like with, Young Frankenstein, it was the horror genre, and with Blazing Saddles, it was Westerns. With Spaceballs, it was obviously like Star Wars and Star Trek and all that. So when he would see kind of like an over saturation of something, he's like, well, now it's time to make fun of it,
Right.
And I feel like that's an art that's been lost. Like the last good parody I can think of, like Andy Samberg made a couple. Like I think Pop Star is one of the most underrated movies of the last 20 years. So Andy Samberg's made like good parodies, and like Walk Hard was a great one. Like obviously Scary Movie back in the day. But I feel like you don't get a lot of that now for some reason, which is odd because there's so much to parody.
I was just going to say one that came out recently, but I don't think it was that recently, is Tucker and Dale versus Evil. It's about
not familiar.
It's a parody about like kids going in the woods on a camping trip and having like psycho locals kill them. But it's all by accident. It's a very funny movie.
Well, even including Pop Star, like that did horribly. I remember I wanted to see it in theaters, and I think it was only in theaters for like 2 weeks or something.
Jeez, that's not good.
Like it did not make a lot of money, but it's a hilarious movie. And for whatever reason, like parodies, there's not been a parody that resonates. Maybe because it's kind of turned into people doing it in the form of sketches on like TikTok and Instagram. But as far as films go, and I mean, this is also an argument for what comedy film has become in general. It doesn't really exist anymore. Great comedy films, but
no, it's been like Superbad was the last great one.
Yeah, I mean, there's others you could argue that were very good.
It's been very good, maybe, but like great. Like Superbad, I would consider a great comedy.
At least that connected with the public,
right?
Like that everyone went and saw. But it's because the kind of sad thing is, like I heard Matt Damon talk about this a little while back, where basically like DVD sales kind of, or the invention of streaming and lack of DVD sales kind of killed comedy, because what would happen with a comedy, like take Office Space is probably the best example I could think of, where Office Space made no money. No one saw Office Space in theaters.
None. But
then for whatever reason, it caught on in DVD sales, and now it's a, cult class. So it's a classic comedy from the late 90s. So studios knew that even if a comedy flopped in theaters, there's a chance they make it up in DVD sales. And now that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Like if a movie flops in theaters, Netflix isn't going to pay a shit ton for it.
I heard.
Why would they?
Yeah, and exactly. I heard Matt Damon actually talking about this not too long ago, and why.
That's
like,
what I said.
Oh, is that what you? Okay, sorry.
Yeah,
but yeah, like
someone clip that for me, please.
Please clip it.
Greg, on the ball as usual.
Sorry, I'm just getting my clips in order.
But yeah. Anyways, we were derailed there, so that gets us back on track, I suppose.
Gene Wilder.
Another great relationship he had for a long time, although this was more of a business relationship that they had. Like I saw an interview where Gene said like they didn't necessarily have a personal relationship where they were out doing bits together at parties like him and Carl. But this is an interesting story from working with him on Young Frankenstein. Mel says it's the only time he was wrong about something, essentially.
I want to ask you about Young Frankenstein, which is easily one of the funniest movies ever made, and you co-wrote this film, and Mel Brooks directed the movie. And I only found out much later on that my favorite scene in the whole movie, and I think for many people their favorite scene, is when Dr. Frankenstein, you do the number, the tap dance number, putting on the Ritz with the monster. And it's so insane and so absurd. And I only realized later on, I guess, that was your idea, and Mel Brooks didn't want to do it. Is that right?
No, I would write all day, and then he'd come over after dinner and look at, yeah. Okay, now we need a villain. The Burgermeister isn't a good enough villain. We need a real villain, and so on and so on. And one night he came over and he looks at the pages and he says, "You tap dance to Irving Berlin." right. In Top Hat and Tails with the monster.
Right.
He said, "Are you crazy? It's frivolous."
Right.
And I started to argue, and then I argued for about 20 minutes till I was at least red in the face. I think it may have been blue. And all of a sudden, he says, "Okay, it's in." And I said, "Well, why did you put me through this?"
Right.
He said, "Because I wasn't sure if it was right or not. And if you didn't argue for it, I knew it would be wrong. But if you really argued, I knew it was right."
Those are the type of the stories you hear about, like the true geniuses. Like,
right.
I would never think I'm going to put this guy through some mental gymnastics and see if he pushes back on me.
He's the Bill Belichick of directors.
Yeah. If I'm ever like, what the fuck are you talking about? I mean it. I'm not testing you. So yeah, I thought that like spoke very well to Mel's kind of decision making, because at first when you're hearing that story, you're like, why would a guy like Mel be that closed-minded? Like, you're making a movie called Young Frankenstein. You know, you're going to be that narrow-minded on something. But then he realized, like, hey, if this is something Gene really wants to do, we're going to keep it in because I trust him. But if he's not passionate about it, I want it out, you know?
Right.
So, you know, the mark of a great filmmaker, Mel, you've passed my test.
He's honored.
I think this next one is about something he actually did end up taking out, right?
Blazing Saddles.
Yes, sir.
We were talking about Blazing Saddles. That movie, I really think, in a lot of ways, changed the game. That's how it felt to me when I watched it at the time. Everyone thought it's the funniest movie we've ever seen when that movie came out. Was anything cut from that film? I mean, it really took everything to the edge. Did you take any scenes out?
You know, I was very brave. I had Final Cut, so the studio actually legally couldn't trim it. They couldn't cut anything. But I had filmed something, and when I saw it, I got scared. I really got scared, and I said, I'm going to take that little scene out. It was the scene in which Madeline Kahn is in her dressing room with Cleavon Little. Mm-hmm. And after they eat Schnitzengruben, she blows out the candles and she says in her German accent, "Oh, is it true? Is it true what they say about you people? How well you're built? Is it true? Is it true? It's all in the dark now." And he said, and Cleavon says, "I hate to disillusion you, man, but you're sucking on my arm."
And on Marin, he said he told the same story, but he said that he's like, now I would have kept it in, which I find interesting because he was,
of all the things in that movie.
Well, it's interesting because it's like it tells you just how the goalposts have changed. We talk about like, oh my God, you know, we can never get away with this now, but it's like we also do get away with so much more. Like a sex joke, you can hear a joke like that on terrestrial radio, probably, you know?
Right.
Like we do get away with a lot more shit now. It's just some of the topics that they got away with, we can't now. So it's just shit just shifts as much as we complain about it, I guess. I think the reason I'm most passionate about that sort of subject is like I say about the trailblazing thing. It's like, why were we allowed to and now we're not? You know, progress should be like, now we're allowed to do all of it. We see the error of our ways previously, you know?
Or if you don't like it, don't see it. Like, that's simple.
Well, so that's the interesting thing about Blazing Saddles and how that's held up. Because like you said, if you watch Blazing Saddles, that might be the least offensive thing in the film, the thing Mel took out. Because it got a disclaimer. This was a big story a year or two ago.
Yeah, it was not long ago.
That like HBO Max put a disclaimer out, like what you're about to see contains blah, blah, blah. Basically, beware of being offended. And I remember that was a big story because a lot of like anti-cancel culture guys were like, fuck this, man. And I was like, no. We should be advocating for that. Yes,
I agree.
It might be a little silly.
I remember that.
But we should be begging for this. Please give us disclaimers on everything. First of all, it's easy for me. I can't even see it. I don't know what's happening.
Right.
But if all you have to sit through is a 6-second, frame that says, "Hey, this contains language and topics you might not like."
Hey, this contains funny stuff.
Yeah, then we're done. Then we get to it. Then we get to see the whole thing. What I hate is there are episodes of, Always Sunny and 30 Rock that now don't exist.
Gone forever.
Where it's like all you had to do was put a disclaimer like, hey, it was a different time when it was done in parody and jest, whatever you have to put on there. But it's still allowed to exist. So I think the disclaimer is a great thing that we should be like essentially advocating for.
Exactly. I think the problem with the cancel culture people is it was almost presented like a trigger warning, and they think that's like,
Yeah, I think my take on all that is you got to be a little lenient. Well,
there's nothing wrong with that.
Give and take once in a while.
It literally doesn't affect the movie at all. So just let it fucking ride.
Yeah. But the Blazing Saddles is a very interesting film for Mel Brooks because, like I said, if you hear him talk, or if you've seen any of his other movies, particularly Spaceballs, you're not like, oh, this is a crazy, edgy guy that would never, like, his stuff's not going to hold up in a few generations. You wouldn't think that of him. But Blazing Saddles is like one of the edgiest movies ever. I think it was like AFI put out the list of the top 100 comedies of all time. I think this was years ago, but at the time at least. And Mel Brooks had 3 in the top 15.
Did he really?
It was like Blazing Saddles, The Producers, and Young Frankenstein were all considered 3 of the best comedies ever made. But Blazing Saddles is very different in the sense that it is, very, very edgy. And we're too sensitive for it today, apparently. So Mel Brooks had a lot of levels to him, I guess is my point. And he was not necessarily uptight about the kind of ground he covered in comedy.
Yep, he was a very determined fella. He
certainly was.
As we'll find out in this next clip.
Is this Anne Bancroft?
Yes.
Yeah, so we hear from his wife here. I've mentioned her a couple times, but Anne Bancroft, very successful, very attractive woman. And I think a lot of people looked at her and Mel and thought, what the hell is going on? And I think it's another example of Mel's persistence.
A guy from way over on the other side of the theater said, "Hey, Anne Bancroft, I'm Mel Brooks. I want you to know that in 2 years, no man had ever approached me with that kind of aggression because I had just done 2 for the Caesar and the Miracle Worker, and people were very scared of me, especially men. My God, what she must be, this strange creature." And this aggressive voice came out from the dark, and I thought it would be a combination of Clark Gable and Robert Taylor and Robert Redford. Turned out to be Mel Brooks. And he never left me. From that moment on, he would say, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to William Morris." He said, "So am I." He said, "Where are you going?" "I'm going to that delicatessen." "So am I." No matter where I said I was going, he said he was going there. "I'm going to the Bonsoir tonight." "So am I." It just went on and on. The man never left me alone. Thank God.
See, kids, persistence is key as long as you're as much of a gentleman as Mel Brooks.
Unless there's no physical contact.
Well, this point has been made a million times, I know, but it is funny to hear. If you hear like a beautiful love story from 60 years ago and said it in 2023, we'd be like, oh, that is sexual harassment.
Sounds it.
He's harassing you.
No, she seems very much in love.
Yeah, it is. It's context, I guess, matters in those situations because Anne Bancroft didn't mind it. And like I said, they had a seemingly a very loving relationship, and when he talks about her, it's beautiful in a way. It's touching. And she couldn't have died too long after Curb Your Enthusiasm, because I believe she was in the last episode of that season that Mel Brooks is in. But we'll get a little more into that in a second.
She died in 2005.
2005, yeah, and I think that season might have been 2004 or maybe even 2005.
Oh wow, he's had to go a while without her. That's sad.
Oh, that's crazy. I meant to say that earlier too. Is like, or maybe I think I brought it up with Mort Saul actually, where Lenny Bruce died in his 40s, and Mort Saul lived another 60 years after that or something.
Yeah,
50 years, whatever it was. That's kind of like. Not that she was still, She had years that she should have lived, unfortunately, but like she was an older woman, and now Mel has been around almost 2 decades without her, which is pretty crazy.
That's sad.
Yeah. That's the tragic thing about getting that old. Like Carl Reiner is no longer with us. Sid Caesar. It didn't dawn on me until just now. All these beautiful relationships I talked about,
they're all sadly ending.
He's alive and they're all gone.
Yeah. She was 73 and died of uterine cancer.
Yeah. So like I said, an older woman technically, but not, she had plenty of years left, I think.
Yeah.
And he's been around for 20 years now since she passed. And it is, I don't know how he's doing today if you went and visited Mel Brooks. But like I remember during COVID, him and his son, like Max, who's a very popular author, they made some video about like, basically stay away from your old people, essentially. Mm-hmm. And Mel Brooks seemed like he was in, for a 96-year-old or 95 at the time, whatever it was, essentially tip-top shape. So, he's managed to keep it together for the most part, but that's the wild thing about like here's something I like about Mel Brooks too, is like in interviews, he seems like a comedian. He seems like a funny guy, whether or not you even find him funny. He has the air of a funny guy. Whereas if like you listen to Norman Lear talk, he just seems like an old grump,
Right.
There's a lot of geniuses in comedy. Woody Allen's another example. A lot of geniuses in comedy, if you saw them in an interview, you'd be like, this is a fucking comedian. But Mel Brooks has like the air of an actual comedian, like a fun-loving guy.
Like a Judd Apatow.
I suppose.
The last clip we have, Curb.
Oh, we're at the last one already? This flew by. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty to talk about with Mel Brooks, but I think we covered the basics essentially. But my favorite thing that Mel Brooks ever did was season 4 of Curb Your Enthusiasm, where the plot line is Mel Brooks seeks out Larry David to star in The Producers on Broadway. And the whole plot line is he's co-starring with Ben Stiller, and eventually Ben Stiller can't stand him. They bring in David Schwimmer, and it results in, and if you know anything about The Producers, this is classic Larry David tying everything together. The end of the season shows that Mel Brooks wanted to make it a bomb so he could stop doing The Producers. Like if he figured he had a production that tanked, they would stop renewing him. And he's like, I know the perfect guy to derail this show. It's Larry David. If I bring in Larry David, it'll be a complete bomb. But then Larry ends up doing a great job, and so it ruins his life. So it's a brilliant plot for a season of television.
Yeah.
And it's one of my favorite seasons. But one of my favorite things is just that the entire time, and while you're watching it, you don't realize why necessarily. It's very well done. But Mel is the only guy, he's the only celebrity cameo that I can think of in the history of Curb. Respond with, if I'm missing someone, respond, blindmike.net. But he's the only celebrity cameo I can think of where the person completely, throughout the duration of their time on the show, agrees with every point Larry David makes.
Oh, yeah, no, that definitely doesn't happen ever again.
Mel Brooks is the only, and I also wonder, because obviously Larry David loved and respected Mel Brooks. So I wonder if part of that was he just wanted Mel Brooks to like him. So that's how he wrote it. But it's very well done where everything Larry says, Mel's got his back, and he's the only one. And this is a scene where Larry has offended Ben Stiller, so Ben Stiller quit the production. And this is the dynamic that they had. I thought it was very good.
You have any complaints? I mean, how's it going for you?
I've got one tiny thing, just one small issue. I'm not happy with the toilet paper in the rehearsal hall.
You're going to get the softest, most beautiful toilet paper. You'll be so happy. You'll be hanging around the toilet every day.
Mel, you'll get me the softer rolls?
You got it.
All right.
I promise.
Can we get to why you asked Larry to come here?
Oh, yeah, we have a little problem. Ben Stiller is gone. He is history. He has left us. He came to me and said, it's either me or Larry David? Make up your mind. You know, I went right, Larry David, still around. He complained about some things, I don't know, minor stuff.
You're kidding.
No, we're not kidding. Ben Stiller quit. You wouldn't sit in the front of a car? You couldn't move into the front of the car?
I mean, I have to go up to. We were 2 minutes away from where we were going.
They were 2 minutes away from where we were going.
To Ben Stiller's birthday party. You didn't bring a present.
He said no gifts.
They always say no gift, but everybody brings a gift.
Oh, so you're at the show, you won't shake his hand.
I happen to have a small phobia about shaking people's hands who have snot on it. That's all. It's a small thing. It's a small little phobia.
And at the birthday party, everybody sang happy birthday.
I don't like
but
the
you.
happy birthday song. I don't sing the happy birthday song.
He never sings the happy
He
birthday
doesn't.
song.
Larry,
I don't like it either. I hate the happy birthday song. It's a trite, cliche song.
I just loved. First of all, credit to Mel Brooks because obviously that show is like improv.
Yeah.
So for him to get like viscerally angry about the Happy Birthday song and refer to it as a trite cliche, like I've had enough of the Happy Birthday song.
And if you haven't seen the show, if memory serves, Ben Stiller is driving Larry and someone else home, and they get out of the front seat, and Larry refuses to move up.
I'm okay. Yeah, no, that's one of my favorite seasons of Curb, and Mel Brooks is phenomenal in it. And then kind of the reveal at the end that it was all the plot of the producers is classic Larry tying everything together.
Mm.
So, you know, at the end of the day, I guess that's my point is that, you know, no matter what Mel has done in his career, he'll really just be remembered for Curb Your Enthusiasm, at least by me.
Yeah, it's either Curb or Norm. I was wondering what it was going to be.
I know. You know what? I didn't even look if Norm Macdonald talked about Mel Brooks. Shame on me.
He probably did.
I'm sure he did at some point. But nonetheless, we've spoken long enough. Mel Brooks, one of the true greats. As I said about Mort Saul, you can't tell the history of comedy without talking about Mel Brooks, one of the most, you know, influential guys ever and beloved filmmakers. So shout out to Mel Brooks. Hope he lives for another 96 years. And if you enjoy the program, if you want to get these episodes a week early, you know, if you're sick of waiting around saying, I want to be the first to watch Why You Laughing, then you can subscribe to the Patreon. And the other stuff you'll get there on the Patreon are bonus episodes, like I mentioned earlier in the show. So if you want, you know, a couple bonus episodes every month, as well as mini episodes, then make sure you get on the Patreon. And the easiest way to find that is blindmike.net. And you can also find free links to the show if you'd rather support us that way. Subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, YouTube, wherever you get podcasts, and leave us a 5-star review. Tap the notification bell, whatever you have to do in order to make sure you know when the show drops every Thursday.
Yeah.
And verygoodShow.org.
VerygoodShow.org. Please.
That's where you can find Craig and all of his business.
All our business. If the idea of improv brunch tickles your fancy, come on over.
If you like Curb, folks, I'm sure this is just as good.
Yeah. There is, guys. From a quick Google, there seems to be a good amount of Mel Brooks and Norm Macdonald.
Damn.
So go look at that, and I'm sure we'll all just have a laugh about it by ourselves.
Join the Patreon, folks. We'll break it down.
Yes.
It's foolish of me. I knew if I ended, I was like, oh, we're ending the episode with Larry David, but I should have ended with Norm.
Yeah, there's a post on our Norm Macdonald on Reddit called Norm Macdonald with Mel Brooks. So,
oh God, he was probably on the show.
He's probably.
Oh well,
it's a nice short. We'll do a short.
Yeah, for another day. But we will talk to you guys next time on Why Are You Laughing?